So if there's anyone outside looking to listen, come on in and take your seats and we'll get started. Great stuff. Thanks for coming along to the session, everybody. My name is Dr. Caroline Sullivan and I'm the Assistant Manager on the Hen Harrier project. Though you're not going to hear much about the Hen Harrier project in this session, we're going to hear from three other speakers on how do payments for ecosystem services work. Before we get going though, in order to avoid the three speakers saying the same thing over and over again, I'm just going to give a brief introduction so that you know what ecosystem services are. Although if you don't know what they are by now, that's a little bit concerning. As you're all aware, ecosystem services are the direct and indirect contributions of ecosystems to human well-being. The services can be provisioning, regulating, habitats, and cultural. So they have a huge span. And the key ecosystems, there's an awful lot of ecosystem services that we've discussed in the course of this conference, but some of the key ones are climate regulation. Europe's terrestrial ecosystems represent a net carbon sink of about 10% of the human-generated emissions of carbon. And I suppose there's been a big focus on the human impact on the ecosystem services that are delivered. And here are some of the wonderful peat habitats that we have in Ireland. This is from the Slieve Mountains. Water purification is a really important ecosystem service that we need to look after very carefully, and the freshwater pearl mussel are going to try and deliver that in spades over the next 5 or 6 years, and Derek will tell you more about that. And of course, soil biodiversity is becoming more and more important in people's minds in terms of ecosystem services that can be delivered. They support a range of provisioning services. Everybody is very focused on how important food is, but in order to deliver that food, we need soil biodiversity. And that's fundamental to soil fertility, and we need to start looking after that as well. There's just a quick flick of a water feature that is found on lots of farms in Ireland, and so depending on how you decide to pay for ecosystem services, these can become very, very important. So who provides these ecosystem services? There's been an awful lot of talk about ecosystem services, but their delivery is one of the key things that we need to focus on. And land managers provide many ecosystem services. In Ireland, they're predominantly farmers. Food provision is arguably delivered or rewarded in the market, but many other services aren't. And high nature value farmland delivers many of the key ecosystem services that have been mentioned throughout this conference. They're generally not rewarded in the market. And this session is just going to focus on those ecosystem services that are delivered through agriculture. We're not saying these are the only ecosystem services. We're not saying this is the only way to deliver them. We're just giving you examples of how we're doing it in certain parts of Ireland at the moment. There's a H&V likelihood map of Ireland, but it could be a land use intensity map, farmland map of Ireland equally. And the blue areas are arguably best adapted to deliver food, and the greener areas are best adapted to deliver some of the carbon sequestration or quality habitats. The yellow areas could be very well adapted to delivering water quality or any other ecosystems that we deem to be valuable enough to encourage the landowners to deliver for us. So what are we paying for in Ireland? How much are we paying for it? Who's benefiting and what are the results? Are all questions that Derek, Sharon and Amanda are very ably going to answer for us. But before they do that, briefly I just want to mention the situation up until now, which has been measures which were prescriptive and rule-based. Again, you should all be fairly familiar with that at this stage. But the key thing, I suppose, of these one-size-fits-all approaches is that the lack of flexibility and the lack of local adaptation was the key thing stemming the results delivered by these. At the session I was just at with Una Fitzpatrick, she mentioned as well that flexibility is key in almost everything we do in life, and it should be the same for our ecosystem service delivery. monitoring and performance indicators weren't present really in these, and there was a focus on administrative verifiability and control as opposed to the results delivered. And that was really clear when you look at the status of mature 2000 sites as reported under Article 17. I think this has been mentioned again and again and again, and that is because it's a really important point. All our important habitats are in bad or inadequate condition at the moment. So what can we do about that? Well, since around the year 2000, a small number of farmers have been paid for the delivery of ecosystem services. You've heard the Boren Program mentioned again and again, and there has been a significant expansion of this in the last while. The Aran Life project started in around 2013. That could not be 100% accurate, but close enough. And since then, the Hen Harrier project and freshwater pearl mussel EIPs have been funded by the Department of Agriculture through the Rural Development Program. And these are very, very important countrywide programs. And additional to that, the additional 20 smaller EIPs, which have this wonderful wide range of focuses, could lead to some really interesting changes in the future in relation to this. I'm actually not going to focus too much on these. One thing I do want to say before I let the others get speaking is how much you pay for ecosystem services at the moment is very much restricted based on the current regulations. There are a wide number of threats to farmland and how it delivers these ecosystem services, and a lot of them can be classified as intensification, conversion or abandonment. So the farmer choosing to do something more financially viable with the land than farming for ecosystem services. So if you're pricing what you pay for farmers, you can calculate it on the basis of opportunity costs, but for most of us we have to use income forgone and additional costs. So that doesn't take into account what the ecosystem services are actually worth. It restricts it to just the income forgone and costs incurred by the farmer who's delivering these important ecosystem services. And certainly from a policy point of view going forward, this is a really important thing that needs to be addressed in the future. And so with no further ado, I want to invite Sharon up to talk about the Boren Program. Thanks, Sharon.
Where's the thing? It just starts working magically. It's not working magically. Excuse me, as soon as I come near technology these days, it stops working. Have we got another button we can press? There we go. Yeah, now it's gone to... Okay, we'll start with the introduction slide, so it's handy. Okay, farming for conservation in the Burren. 20 years in 10 minutes. I'm not known for talking for 10 minutes. I actually almost feel I don't need to stand up here and talk at all, because I've heard what we've been saying for years, reiterated by so many different people today and yesterday, and that's brilliant. The principles that were developed in the Boren have gone out there, our babies have flown, and they're doing good things elsewhere. So this is really going to be a discussion of how the agri-environmental scheme in the Burren evolved over time. Now, the ecosystem services we're paying for here, of course, is habitats, biodiversity, or let's be retro and call it nature. It all started when Brendan wasn't so grey, back when he did his PhD, and he looked at the impact of agricultural practices on the natural heritage of the Burren, and really he crystallised how important the traditional winter grazing practices are in the Boren. But the most important thing of Brendan's PhD was he went out there and talked to the farmers. This was a relatively new thing to do at the time. They were the land managers, they were the people who were in a position to actually deliver management of the Boren. So he went out there, he listened to them, he heard their stories, and he took that information. And he was also then able to see, we're really having trouble with the technology. There we go. How agriculture had changed, why it had changed. The farmers told him why it changed and how this had led to the loss of balance. The fact that we were seeing reduced grazing on the winterages, this was where most of the nature, the biodiversity interest was. We were seeing an intensification on the summer land. This led to the winterages becoming undergrazed over time, so that affects the plant communities which support the invertebrates. We were seeing an increased rate of scrub encroachment. We were also seeing a form of intensification where farmers were making silage on the greenland, taking it onto the winterages. That has an implication for water quality and for habitats, particularly the sensitive aquatic habitats. The sad thing is, all this degradation was happening when the SACs, the designations, had been put in place, and there was vast amounts of money going into the Burren through the then Agri-environmental Program, the REPS Program. Because really, these were about stopping farmers doing negative things. They weren't about encouraging them to do positive things. There were things they could do under REPS, but being farmers, they took the easiest options along the way. So, Brendan's PhD didn't sit on a shelf and gather dust like so many of them. It went on to form the basis of the Boren Life Project. Boren Life Project did an awful lot of things, but one of the main things was it was about taking the solutions that farmers suggested that they needed to put into place to improve the grazing and funding them to do it and then monitoring the impact. So we know what the problems are. There was multiple solutions, which I'm not going to go into. But the thing was, we gave the farmers the money to carry out these actions. And what we found was we didn't always get the required response. We didn't get that increase in grazing levels and habitats in better condition. So why? What was the problem? Well, the problem was there was no incentive to actually do it. Farming in a place like the Burren is hard, particularly if you're talking about doing this in winter. It's much easier to put your cattle in a slatted shed, watch Coronation Street, go out, flick the light on, chuck them some silage, go back in and watch whatever's on after Coronation Street. So we needed to look at providing an incentive. And that's where the development of the results-based agri-environment programs came in. And really this was the blue sky thinking from Brendan and James at the time. So the Boren Farming Conservation Program was the next stage, and essentially what we were looking here was paying for results. This is really making conservation a product, just as much as the livestock that the farmers on these farms are producing. The product we were asking them to deliver was the species-rich grazed habitats in good condition. How we were getting to do this, how we were going to pay for it, was we were going to score every field that was in the programme every year and give them a score from 1 to 10, 1 being poor, 10 being high. The theory being the better the product, the higher the field score and the higher the payment the farmer would receive. So this is all about incentivising and rewarding delivering the best product. This is the great big carrot. However, we went for a hybrid approach because in the Burren we felt just going results-based was not going to work. There was an awful lot of work that farmers would have to do to deliver these, the result we were looking for. Again, something I've heard today, programs have become increasingly farmer-led. It's the farmer who decides what to do. We don't tell them how to get species-rich grasslands in good condition. We tell them what we want. It's up to them to actually get there. So the farmer decides what work they needed to do to deliver the environmental benefits, to get the best product for themselves, so they can increase their money that's coming in. Interestingly, one other thing we have to consider is work that farmer might want to do to help keeping them farming in future. There's no point in paying for stuff now if we're not going to have farming in the future. So sometimes it's about things that will help them to keep going. And the other thing we stopped doing was we stopped giving them 100% of the money to do jobs. And we pay according to the delivery. So something that gives an obvious environmental benefit gets funded at 75%. If there's a longer term benefit to the farmer, which is more obvious, then they get paid at a lower rate. That way farmers take more interest in what they're doing and have better buy-in. So this was all brilliant. We'd put in the submission to the Department of Agriculture that we were going to have a scoring system and fields 1 to 10, and then suddenly we had to come up with one. So, and we had a short period, I think it was 3 weeks, so there was a lot of frantic going through literature. And I'm not one to reinvent the wheel. Sure, it'd be hexagonal if I did it. But I came across something in Canada where they developed a system to assess rangeland health and other sort of habitats over in vast areas of Canada. And I looked at it, and from what we'd learnt during Burren Life, during the BFs and earlier stages of other projects we've been involved in, I could see how we could adapt it to the Burren. So that was what we did. We adapted a system that was already there. And I think people are now adapting the system that we adapted from a system. And that's the key. No scoring system is right or wrong. It's right for what you need it to do. Sure, you could come up with a system for scoring bus stops if you wanted to. So the things we look at in the Burren are particularly grazing driven. So we look at things that reflect habitat condition in terms of grazing and stock management. We also look at problem species here, the rate at which we've got scrub encroachment, bracken, increases in purple moorgrass due to a lack of summer grazing, which happens in some areas. And we don't actually go out and count species. We judge ecological integrity by eye. And part of the reason we do this is we've got such a heterogeneous set of habitats there. They grade from one to another within a few metres. Now, how it works is for each of these criteria that are assessed in the field, and it's a farm advisor who will go out and do this every year, there's a weighted score. So, for example, for grazing, optimum grazing, you can score 15. And there's a range of scores between that go down to -35, which is very, very undergrazed. So you add those criteria together and you get the field score. It really isn't rocket science. It's dead simple. All you're asking is, are there problems? What are those problems? How bad are they? And that's what the scoring system is doing. When we set out for the scoring system, what we wanted was something simple, and I think we have developed something that's simple. It's detailed in how you do it in the scoring guidelines. We wanted something adaptable, which is why we call them guidelines, not instructions, because you can adapt them to different habitats and situations. We also wanted something that was transparent for the farmers. So if a farmer's field scores is 6 instead of a 10, they would know why that field was scoring that. The figure wasn't just being plucked out of the air. So the scoring system we've tweaked over the years, but essentially it's stayed the same along the way. And then we changed our name again. I struggle to keep up with it at times. We've now become the Boren Program. So we are a locally led, results-based agri-environment programme, and we're actually funded under the Rural Development Programme. We're not one of the EIPs. When they started talking about EIPs, we said, what are they? And they said, oh, you're one. And we said, great, can we have some funding? And they said, no, you're not innovative anymore. Thanks. So that's the problem of blazing the trail. Locally led, we have a local office and staff in the Burren. Yeah, we're there to administer the programme, but much more importantly, we're there as a support for the farmers and the advisors. Anyone could come in. When you're asking farmers and advisors to move to delivering conservation as a product, it's new to them. There's a lot of hand-holding, a lot of pats on the back need to be given. If you want to bring people with you, you have to encourage them. So that's, I think, our most important role in many ways. We increase the number of farmers at every step. However, moving from our experimental development phases to being an actual official agri-environment programme was like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole, because there is a framework under the EU legislation as to what you have to have in agri-environment programmes. And we didn't quite fit that. We've shaved a few corners off the square peg, and if we hit it very hard, it does go into the hole. But it is something that needs addressing going forward. So I'm not going to talk about money, it's terribly common, but what I do want to look at to finish with is the impact of paying for ecosystem services and what's happened in the Burren. Yeah, we were able to show that we had improved the habitat condition. The field scores act as a simple monitoring. Over time, we can show the average field score's gone up, and the amount of areas scoring 8, 9 and 10 is much higher now than it was at the beginning. So tick that box. It's had a positive impact on the Burren landscape. This has a knock-on effect. This is the bedrock of tourism in the Burren. People wanted to come and see the flowers, not rank grassland. There's benefits for water quality, efficient usage. Very importantly, there's the financial input into the local economy. And while we're paying the farmers, that money does move round, because a lot of the farmers are too elderly or have off-farm jobs. They can't do the work themselves, so they pay contractors to do it. There's also local industries been developed. There's a number of people now making the Burren gates, which were encouraged as a better aesthetic in the landscape. But one of the most important things I think that came out of the Burren is the catalyst for other projects and the knowledge transfer. It's the lessons that we've learned. People talk about us being a model. We're not a model. We came up with a set of principles, and it's those principles that I think are being adapted into other life projects, the other EIPs, and other HMV areas around Europe. And the last slide, Dr. Delgado Rosa actually made that I didn't have to say anything because he said it for me in his talk this morning. Another really important thing that came out of the Burren was it's helped to change mindsets. Both of the farmers, they're being valued for what they can deliver as a product. They're partners. They're not just the scapegoats for everything that's going wrong. They're not the problem. We were also very lucky in that Commissioner Hogan asked to come over and see us with some of his staff, and we spent the day out in the Burren showing him what was happening on the ground. He was talking to the farmers who always tell him the good things about the results base, the bad things about it. So in that way, we were hoping we would influence agri-environment so that it will change a little bit in Europe and maybe make the whole a little bit more suited for our slightly square peg. So really, that's the end of it. But we've had 20 years. It's been really, really important. The EIPs are testing things out, but going forward, in some ways, they've missed out that Brendan's PhD stage. And you cannot underestimate how much value that background and that time to develop something along the way has. I'll finish there.
Thanks a million, Sharon. That was excellent. We are running 2 polls during this session. If any of you are using Slido, you can answer one of the questions now, and when the speakers are finished, we'll swap it over to another question just to see what you're thinking on that. So that's the tech side of things. And now I'm going to invite Amanda. So we're going to have quite a long discussion, or some discussion time at the end of this session, so you can ask all your questions at that stage. And Amanda, can I get you up now? Thank you.
Hold off until you hear my talk before you keep voting.
Job of a chair is to fill in during these tech issues. I want to keep people in the room. There we go.
Now, worth the wait, hopefully. Payments for ecosystem services are incredibly important for the high nature value farmland of the Aran Islands. We've been developing programs for payments for ecosystem services over the last 5 years of Aran Life, and we will continue to do so in our EIP funded Quave New Aran project. So the EIPs, as you've heard already, are funded through the RDP and the Department of Agriculture. The Aran Islands are incredibly biodiverse. Over 500 plant species occur on the islands, and it's an incredible statistic when you consider they're 40 square kilometres in area, and that is equivalent to over half Ireland's national total flora. Along with the fantastic plant species that we have fantastic invertebrate diversity and many bird species that don't do particularly well on the mainland, have very good breeding successes on the islands, such as Lapwing. The habitats that are responsible for creating this fantastic diversity are farmed habitats, limestone pavement, orchid-rich grassland, and mac-air habitat. The farming on the islands, however, is economically poor. The average farm size on the islands in Sharon would be 6 hectares, in Ishman 11 hectares, in Inishmore 20 hectares, compared to the national average farm size of 32 hectares. Along with this small farm size, it's a corresponding small herd size, and the farms have a highly fragmented farm structure. This map just shows a typical farm on Inishmore. The land parcels are indicated in blue there, and the farm holding is scattered throughout the islands. So a farm may have 42 land parcels, and that would break down into about 150 different fields. So this low farm income and highly fragmented farm structure means that farming is very labour intensive, and that brings with a number of challenges. Farms become abandoned, there's no money in farming, and farms scrub up with briars and blackthorn very quickly. Boreens, these are narrow little roadways that are used to access remote parts of the farm. They become blocked up, which leads to further parts of the farm being abandoned and becoming overgrown and scrubbed because they're no longer accessible. Water is a very big challenge on the islands for both humans and grazing animals. There's no streams or rivers on the islands. If there's no water available in a field, it won't be grazed and it'll become abandoned and scrub up. If your rain catcher is broken in a remote part of the field, the money isn't available or justifiable to repair it if the labour required is so great, and the money to repair it would only give you 2 to 3 weeks grazing. So we had 2 elements to our payment structure. First was a one-off payment. So like Sharon was saying, we have a sort of a hybrid programme of payments. The first for scrub cutting. Now scrub cutting is very hard manual work on the islands, and no machinery is suitable for the small fields and the rough rocky terrain. Hand tools, scrub is hand cleared, and maybe with the strimmer where it's possible to use. So our payments were based on the density of the scrub and the area of the scrub. And we cleared 92 hectares as part of Aran Life of scrub on the islands this way. Boreens, similarly, were costed on the density of the scrub that were blocking them, as well as the length of the boreen. And 28 kilometres of boreens on the islands were cleared as part of Aran Life. Water infrastructure. This involved building rain tanks or repairing existing rain tanks on the islands. Over 120,000 was spent bringing rain tanks and renewing rain tanks into fields on the islands. So clearing the scrub is only half the battle to tackling the challenges. Getting the grazing right is the next challenge, and it's very important to have the fields, the species-rich grassland, optimally grazed. And this usually meant grazing the winterages down to a short turf during the winter, or maybe giving it a flash graze during the summer if there was higher fertility levels or where growth was increased. So we had a simplified 5-point scale, and this was based on the favourable conservation of the habitat. So it was intuitive to apply, but it could be verified by monitoring. So this was so I'll just go through the first. Score 5 was our highest score. It's for good quality priority habitat. It's well managed, high species diversity. Grazing was obvious in these fields. There was a range of vegetation height. Score 4 then was the next. This was priority habitat. It had high species diversity, but it was appropriately grazed for the most part, but there was a scrub and bracken encroachment, and €125 per hectare was given for this score. Score 3B, positive priority habitat, positive indicator species present, was not optimally grazed, had a scrub or bracken issue, and €100 per hectare was given for this. Score of 3A then was introduced to cover areas of priority habitat that didn't need grazing. So our score was for grazing. We were paying for grazing. So priority habitat that was in good condition, that didn't need grazing, such as limestone, bare limestone pavement, didn't receive any money. But priority habitat that was not grazed and maybe had a substantial build-up of grass also didn't receive any funds. Score 2 then was for semi-improved habitat. So it would have been grass-dominated, higher fertility, and in the context of the islands was sort of typical of more recently made grasslands. So this is sort of hard to see maybe, but how did this scoring system and the actions of the Aran Life project impact on the island? So the top map there shows what it was at the start of the project. We had the darker colour green is the higher scores. So at the start of the project, it was a lighter colour green, and the bottom, this is Inishman, by the way, and the bottom map there shows the effect of the grazing score and the payment for actions such as the scrub cutting and water provision and clearing borings. So incredible impact on promoting and maintaining and conserving the priority grassland habitats of the islands. So if we want fantastic species-rich grasslands, we need farmers, and we need, on the islands, we need the continuation of low-intensity farming practices. And to do this, payment structure is vital, that is locally adapted and suits the farming structure. And this can be adapted to other areas, but it has to be locally adapted and fit the regional differences of the systems in each area. So, Sinead, Gurmil Mockett.
Thanks very much, Amanda. See what happens when you force people to give 10-minute overview of really large, complex projects. They do it in less than 10 minutes. So we should have plenty of time for discussion. And I'll hand over to Derek. That's not a license to go over time, Derek.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Caroline. This is, I'm here on behalf of the Freshwater Mussel EIP, which is these are European innovation partnerships, and very innovative and exciting, and fair play to the Department of Agriculture, funded by Department of Agriculture, for taking these steps to test new ideas in terms of agri-environment throughout the country. This is the pearl mussel side of things, and I suppose the big thing you'll find here is that, you know, Sharon started out with Brendan, you know, in '98, looking at a results-based approach towards conserving and enhancing Burren species-rich grassland. Then, you know, as time progresses, looking at other targets, we've got the Aran Islands, similar enough species-rich grassland. We've got Caroline here with hen harrier looking at non-habitat targets, i.e. like species and so on. So I suppose by way of background, in terms of freshwater pearl mussel, this freshwater pearl mussel EIP, we're looking at the top 8 catchments in Ireland. So we're looking at, we've got a Glaskeelan in Donegal, Bunthurha, County Mayo, we've got 2 in Connemara, 3 in Kerry, and we've got Oneoff down in West Cork by itself. Now, I suppose one big thing about these areas is that there's quite a distinctive. It was very interesting yesterday with one of the climate change sessions where there was a lad by the name of what I can't remember, but a very interesting modelling for how climate change will influence rainfall, how and where it'll be most intense. And just looking at the rainfall map, they overlay very, very well on our catchments here. High nature value areas, these that they are, primarily peatland catchments. I suppose it's freshwater pearl mussel EIP, of course, and it's very important aspect to go through its life cycle. That'll inform a lot of what we need to do or what can be done and our approach and so on. The first thing is that it's a very complex life cycle. It's one a species that lives to 120, 140 years, so it's incredible to think that we've got individuals in rivers in Ireland that have been there before Ireland was an independent state, before World War I, and so on. It's an indicator of exceptionally clean water. It's one of these species that it's the key indicator of pristine water. It depends on that to thrive. The key pressures on it, I suppose, are siltation, nutrients, and drainage. And I suppose from our perspective, drainage we'd see as probably the big issue. If we can sort drainage, then, I should say flow, which is ultimately influenced by drainage. If we can sort the flow, we can sort out to a good extent the sediment and nutrient issues as well. And by flow, we're talking about a catchment would typically be very wet, peatland catchments, drained, and what happens in that case is that typically your peak flows in heavily drained catchments tend to be much higher than those that are less drained or undrained. So they're key issues. How on earth do we go about designing a program that can target freshwater pearl mussel? Because in the Burren you can look at species-rich grassland. They've developed scorecards to assess the quality of that, and the payments relate to that. How on earth do you do it with freshwater pearl mussel? Do you go tramping around the rivers? Do you, how do you go about it? And I suppose the very first thing to bear in mind here, and probably one of the most important principles with the results-based approach, and the key aspect to bear in mind with results-based, or even possibly even more accurately described, quality-based. So the higher the quality of the ecosystem service, the higher the payments. And it's a pretty simple, approach. It's one in which, I suppose, as an analogy, in terms of, from a farmer's perspective, with the current setup where you've got measures-based approach, everyone gets the exact same payment. Everyone in the room gets €5,000, regardless of how good or bad you are at farming and how good or bad your ecosystem outputs are. So the first thing, I suppose, to bear in mind in designing something here is what kind of habitats are they in, what kind of catchments are they in. This is a picture of Bunthurha, which would be pretty much the top freshwater pearl mussel catchment in Europe. What is already being delivered there in terms of ecosystem services, biodiversity, carbon sequestration, and so on. The list goes on. So it's extremely important when you're designing a results-based program to consider your targets. Okay, it's freshwater pearl mussel. Do we just dive in only looking at freshwater pearl mussel? Do we look at additional benefits? It's a mighty opportunity to look at the very broad picture as well. And you'll see how that feeds into how we're designing the program. Again, coming back to this idea that the challenges of, a complex species target that you can't monitor. It lives to 120 years, so the pluses or minuses over a period of 5 years really isn't going to be obvious. It's 20 years. It's a long-term monitoring that the changes will be found. I suppose the first thing there is do you look at it on a river-by-river basis? Of course you don't. It's a catchment basis. It must be the entire catchment, so that's extremely important. Then the next step is what surrogates can we use if we're not using freshwater pearl mussel as our key indicator? What result indicators can we use? And in our case, the obvious ones are the habitats that are already there. What are the condition of those habitats that are there? We're looking at grassland, we're looking at peatland, we're looking at scrub, woodland as well. And then it's connectivity with watercourses. So where, Sharon and Amanda were talking about species-rich grassland, the better the quality, the more, wildflowers in it, the better the score. So we're going to use those as our surrogates. So the better the quality of the land, better quality, better condition, the land, the peatland, the grassland, the better the quality of the rivers. And I suppose in terms of the biology of freshwater pearl mussel as well, you have these flushing and seepages that come off the riverbank into the river that provide food for the young mussels as well, which is extremely important. So we have developed scorecards. We've, I suppose, advanced and adapted the Burren that has moved on to, to become, through Harrier, through Orbap's project that I'll talk about in a minute, to become indicators of the quality of peatland, grassland and scrub. Another aspect as well is, like, what do we pay, who do we pay, and so on. We've been through that to a good extent. One very nifty way of potentially incentivizing improvements to get quality to where we want it to be is to use the payment bands, payment increments. From a score perspective, we've got along the x-axis at the bottom, we have a score of 0 to 10, as the same with Sharon's and in the Burren. The higher the score, closer to 10, the higher the payment. 10 out of 10, very good payment. In this case, as in the Burren, 3 out of 10, 2, 1, 0, there's no payment, not delivering that service. It's very straightforward. But there's a good jump up to a 4 out of 10. It slowly increases to a 7 out of 10, and then a good jump again to an 8 out of 10. So from our perspective, we want to be able to say to a farmer that, well, we want to give them the opportunity as such that if they're at a 5 or a 6, that they know that if they achieve an 8, it's actually really quite a good jump up to that level. And that's that key incentive, I suppose, to keep progressing on up the ladder. And from our perspective as well, again, back to our targeting side of things, with freshwater pearl mussel is obviously our target here. The perfect scenario for us is pretty much an 8 out of 10. But for those additional benefits, those additional services that are over and above perhaps what freshwater pearl mussel need, the 9 and the 10 out of 10 are for extra species richness for that really good grassland or whatever it may be. Again, it's a good tool from an incentivization perspective. And Amanda showed a few examples of different scores. Very straightforward here. On the left-hand side, pretty much bare peat. It's very clear, low scoring, no payment. Moderate in the centre, high quality, high score, high payment. And very quickly farmers, get this very, very quickly. And I suppose where we would like farmers to be is to be able to use this as an additional market, an additional source of funding, and see these as a resource, see their land as a resource, particularly in these areas. And I mean, we've got ANC's areas of natural constraints, and I mean, these are really areas of natural resources that could be, once payments are related to the quality of these habitats. So another aspect of our freshwater pearl mussel approach as well is the flooding. Of course, it comes up at most meetings. What are you going to do about flooding, And from a freshwater pearl mussel perspective, flooding is a really, really important aspect in the life cycle, I suppose, of freshwater pearl mussel. The point at which the river overtops the banks, the river loses its velocity and erosion ceases and so on. So it's a really, really important aspect, the overtopping of banks. So from our perspective, based on the relative score of the land adjacent to the river, will give rise to a flood plain payment too. And then I suppose the final approach here as such is, again in the Burren, one can look at excellent grassland and improve that, and what happens to the worst land, maybe the green land, isn't so much of an issue, but where you're looking at an entire catchment, you're looking at improving the best and maintaining the best, but the worst will ultimately give rise to whether things work or not. So from that perspective, what we've designed is a whole farm assessment. And it's quite a simple approach, really. Once lands are scored, with a scorecard and so on, each plot out of 10 and so on, and the relevant payment has been calculated. There's a whole farm assessment. Are there any issues on that farm? Be it sheep dip that's running into a river? Is there a massive drain that's just going straight down into the river itself? Is there cattle accessing the river? And the whole farm approach gives us this kind of lever, I suppose, to really heavily incentivize away from very seriously damaging activities. For example, there's 4 categories. Poor is the lowest, which is a multiplication factor of 0.3. So if, for example, your payment, for argument's sake, is €1,000, and you get a whole farm approach of perhaps this lower figure, maybe, and there are very often small pinch points that give rise to these issues on farms. Your whole farm assessment on your €1,000 would be down to 300. On the other end of the scale, perhaps the upper picture, we want to show that, look, if things are going very well, if you're providing an excellent service, you ought to be rewarded for that. So there's a bonus there that your €1,000 goes up to €1,200. So that's something that it's an approach that we can, capture the whole farm within the catchment. And I suppose, how does it look on the ground? Your typical scenario, I've got it before and after. This may be hard to spot the differences, but on the left-hand side of that, there's a kind of a perforated line that runs up and down. But on the left-hand side of that, it's small enough. But the bottom line there is that there's a range of scores. So you're talking about some people could come into the programme with relatively high scores and get a relatively high payment. As you move along, a typical farm will have some peatland. In these catchments, we'll have some peatland, we'll have some maybe species-rich grassland, maybe some wet grassland. There may be some problems there as well. I know we've exaggerated in this case, of drains going straight down in, severe cattle poaching, maybe overgrazing, maybe rhododendron in the peatlands, and they would be elements that would give rise to the lower score. The key here is that you get what you pay for. You pay for what you get. So you save money on, from a perspective of someone that isn't doing what they ought to do, and you're rewarding those that actually do a very good job. Okay, what a minute is it? Oh, thereabouts, okay, perfect. So one thing I didn't talk very much about is supporting actions, and that's how do we improve our score and so on. And the reason I'm kind of deliberately, I suppose, only giving it a bit of a nod, but there's a payment stream in this programme as well to allow farmers to actually improve their score. It could be fencing, it could be putting in cattle troughs, building on the work, I suppose, the very good work of Kerry Life that have designed measures to negate any problems that may arise on the farm. And the whole idea is that it's a results-based approach so that a farmer gets paid for what their land produces as it stands. Supporting actions allow them to increase that score. And I suppose to just about conclude almost, the overall approach that we're taking here is a simple habitat quality plus a full payment, if that's to be the case, multiplied by the whole farm score is equals the final output of that. I suppose then to conclude, I've previously been involved with a lot of colleagues here on the ORBAPS project as well, and that was one in which we, again, adapting the Burren model, bringing that on, and we applied that across 6 different measures. One of them was breeding wagers. We were looking at species-rich grassland with marsh fertility in Leitrim. We looked at vineyards and olive groves and almond groves in Spain, and that was very nice. This was all to demonstrate and to test the approach towards results-based payment schemes. And I must say, in terms of value for money and overall approach, and ultimately delivering a proper result and paying for it is certainly, in my view, the way to go. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Derek. I'll get the other speakers up to have a chat at this stage. We might have a look at the results of the poll, if possible. So, in terms of ecosystem services, what are you willing to pay for? It looks like fire resilience. Nobody. That's obviously unfair because delivering high quality habitats is going to ultimately, hopefully, deliver an awful lot of the other ecosystem services underneath it. And I guess it's nice to see that's being recognised in the room today. Possibly the wrong room to be asking that question because of the ultimate skew, but it's something that we need to start getting into the general psyche more. I have also asked the question of whether, so we're just going to close that now. Do you think that farmers are adequately rewarded for the delivery of ecosystem services? I suppose before you answer that, bear in mind that bear in mind that while there is an increase in the number of results-based programs out there, it is only open to quite a limited number of the farmers in the country, and it's something I personally would like to see expanded, but also not to the point where you lose the local adaptedness of these programs. So you can answer that away as you wish, and we might have a bit of a discussion. I'll take some questions from the floor in a moment, but just before that I want to kind of focus in on one of the points that you made, Sharon, and that's the fact that an awful lot of the EIPs in particular are jumping from, we're going from 0 to program in a very, very short space of time, and in the Hen Harrier project we're very aware of that as well. And so I wonder if you could comment on your experiences in terms of getting farmers on board, because the idea of paying for ecosystem services makes sense, but when you talk among your peers about it, all you hear about is how it's good, and you forget that farmers don't necessarily know what you're talking about or how they might be the key part of the machine in delivering it. And so how do you communicate with them to the point where they understand what you're asking for and realise that they're the key thing in what you're looking for?
Well, I think we were lucky because we started off relatively small. Through Burren Life, the way we communicated what was happening was through demonstration days, where we'd invite farmers from all over the Burren to come and look what was happening on the farms. The key actually was not necessarily myself and Brendan doing all the talking, but was getting the farmer to do the talking. And what we actually discovered, one of the things we looked at in Burren Life in particular, was shifting from silage feeding to concentrate feeding. Now, for the 20 Farmers in Life project, they were getting subsidised to do the shift, so they were getting a certain amount of money towards the concentrate feed. What we found was after we'd had open days, people had come out, seen what was happening, talked to the farmers, people started to shift to concentrate feeding outside of the programme. So really the education point of farmer training, holding on-site training, some of it's classroom, but really being able to take farmers out and show them what's happened. And you're more likely to get that farmers to come on board if you start building slowly. It's very hard to get everybody in at the first sort of intake unless they know what's going to happen, because they will be mistrustful. A lot will sit on the fence. We had guys who came into the BFCP who had no real interest in doing it. They were looking for added income, but they had no real interest. But over time, mindsets do change. People will always sort of follow what they see as success.
For sure. Amanda, how did you...
Well, I suppose we're different in the EIP system in that we have the build-up of Aran Life, the 5 years previous, not to mention the 2 or 3 years that Patrick McGurn was working on the life application on the islands. So farmer buy-in is critical. You know, you need to have farmer buy-in for these projects beforehand. With us, nobody came in and said, like in the Burren, nobody came in and said, you have to do this, this and this to the farmers. You listen to the farmers, you find out what their challenges are, what their issues are, and you work on best ways to address those issues. Farmer buy-in, getting key farmers with you, you know, that can bring along the rest of them, that's key as well, critical.
Yeah. And Derek, you worked on a smaller pilot, the ORBAPS program, before I know you have no participants in the freshwater pearl mussel program yet, but how are you tackling that side of things?
Well, I suppose it's probably good because it gives a good range of, from a pearl mussel perspective, because we're just starting. We've actually just in the process of launching the program as well, and from a standpoint where there would have been no history of targeted schemes like this in North Connemara, South May and so on. I mean, essentially consultation meetings, digesting all of the various issues that are raised to that, processing those, building that into the overall programme. Another big thing as well in terms of champion farmers, as such, for want of a better word, perhaps those that are inclined to take a lead in these areas, bringing them to the Burren, see what the story is here, to your own project, the Hen Harrier project, so that at least one can see what has happened elsewhere and how can that to be developed in those places. So that's the point that we're at, and from a start, I suppose.
Yeah, and I suppose just to give the Hen Harrier project perspective as well, because we've been up and running for almost 2 years now. We took in, so the Boren Program has around 500 participants, and we took in over 600 participants in year 1, and certainly it's something that we have to be very cognizant of the whole time. Are the farmers we're paying very, very clear on what we're paying them for? But we also found that the program doesn't become real to them until you pay them. And it's at that point that they begin to focus on what changes they can make to increase their payments. So it's just it's an interesting ongoing program for delivering these ecosystem services. And we'll take a couple of questions from the floor. Who wants in first? The gentleman at the very back there.
Hi, Paddy Woodworth. A really, really interesting session. But I've been talking to people in the Burren for a while about this, and I still don't quite get, and I'd almost like some anecdotal evidence as to how you reach agreement. And it appears from people I've talked to that you do reach agreement fairly easily on the scoring. I kind of envisage endless wrangling over, is this really species-rich grassland or not, and how do you prove it? Can you explain that a little more?
Well, first, we actually have 2 scoring systems. We have one for winterages. Now, if I was to try and just count species, it wouldn't necessarily work, because it's not always the quantity, it's sometimes the quality. And you can have some of the plant communities that are on very skeletal soils. They're naturally more depauperate, but they are what they should be. If we try to go and count species all over, so we're using a lot of the issues as surrogates. People often bring this up, but once you walk them through the Burren, it's actually quite easy to see on the ground. In terms of winterages, they usually are what they can be. There's things you can pick up that will tell you things aren't quite right. For example, the common daisy that you see in your garden, if you're seeing a lot of that in a winterage, then you know it's not quite right. There's too much summer grazing going on. We don't just do winterages, though. We realised we had a lot of lowland grasslands, meadow type, and some really high quality. And there, again, I didn't reinvent the wheel. I pinched work that had been done in the Peak District Hay Meadows project. And there we do go out and do assess a conservation value based on a suite of species. So your high quality prima donnas down to your species that might be good for pollinators, but you find in more average grasslands with fertiliser and that. And in that way, we were able to put a conservation value on those things. So it's not as complicated as it seems at the end of the day. You do have results-based programs, particularly Germany and France, where it's purely species counting. And what I would say about those is, yeah, you get a payment for having 10 species, you might get a slightly higher payment for having 14 species, but where's the incentive to change your management to encourage the species to go from 10 to 14? And I think that pure results-based in those contexts actually is going to just preside over slow degradation.
Thanks, Sharon. Do Amanda or Derek have anything to add to that? Because the scorecards they measure quite a range of things. Do you guys have anything to add to that?
I must say, like, from the work in the Burrens one, I suppose the importance of them, and Paddy is absolutely right there, you know, like the +1 point, you know, and anecdotally, is it a 4 or a 5 or whatever on earth, but their importance is extremely important. Their value is extremely important. It underpins the score that someone gets. So, I mean, I think the correct design of those can't be underestimated. And I would say also from a measures-based perspective, correct design and schemes is extremely important, but the correct design of these well testing across a whole range of peers and so on is extremely important.
I suppose our scoring system is slightly different from the others, and that's just a 5-point scheme. And it's quite obvious when you go into a score 5 field that it is a score 5 field. And one of our farmers actually asked us at one of our meetings, how do we know it's a score 5 field? And could you produce some sort of a booklet or something that could inform us better on why a score 5 field is a score 5? So we produced, along with a series of other booklets, the flora, the indicator species, the positive indicator species that you would hope to find in your score 5 field. Now, obviously, the flowers won't be on the plants all year round, but the diversity that you find in these species-rich grasslands, it's quite obvious, even when they're not in flower, that they are of high score.
Yeah, and I think from our perspective as well, the scorecards are available online, and there's a very detailed guidance on what is poor, what is middling, and what is good for everything that's being assessed. But also for the EIPs in particular, and I guess the Boren Program isn't static either. These things have flexibility built into them, and that's one of the key things, that if we find that something isn't a reasonable measure of what we're looking for, that can and needs to be able to change.
I suppose, Caroline, just saw something about admin costs there on the questions, and just as part of our innovation, we'll be trying to reduce administration costs by introducing farmers' self-assessment.
Yeah, one of the key criticisms of a results-based program or approach is that the admin costs are very, very very high. No need to go very, very. So if you guys could all give an overview of, our admin costs are 15%. Do you guys have?
They're even higher in an island context.
Yeah.
We don't have a nice body of farm advisors or planners to do the farm plans. We've 3 of us working on the project, and we do the farm plans. So that's an extra cost onto the project, where it might be farmed out to farm advisors in other projects. And the cost of working on an island, the logistics of working on 3 islands, and the travel costs associated with that. So part of our innovative elements to our project is to reduce the admin costs by trialling farmer self-assessment of the grazing score, as well as using drones to do farm plans and to map in scrub and identify the issues on the farm.
Interesting. And do you guys have any admin cost comments? Because it is a big issue for these.
Yeah, well, do we really know what the admin costs were of the National Agri-environment schemes anyway? They will cost more, but also you have to remember that we're there at filling roles that used to be provided through Chogus advisory services, which aren't there to farmers anymore. Possibly over time, as farmers become more aware, they'll need less support, and it could go back down. The other thing is, okay, there's billions been spent on biodiversity, agri-environment in Europe. Where are we? We're in a worse situation than we were before. So, if we do something where we can actually show there is a benefit, it costs more to do, but you're spending the money better and getting something for it, is that not better than it just being really a social security scheme at the end of the day?
Derek, do you have an admin? Lovely. Margaret, who works for the Department of Agriculture, I'll just call you out, has something to say as well. Do you want to?
Hi there, hello. We think that that the admin costs are actually very good value, as it happens, because that these are for professionals who are out in the field, who the farmers have the daily access to. It also means that that young people who are the environmental professionals will get work in their own area, will be spending salaries in their own area, and the whole purpose of these schemes is that they are locally led, and that will give all of the teams the kind of flexibility to respond to the challenges out there that we would not have in-house. So, that is a vital element of it as well. Part of these schemes is that there is the ongoing scientific monitoring as well, and that wouldn't happen if the model was taken in-house.
Absolutely,
So
yeah,
I
that's
think it's very good
a really
value
good point,
for money.
Margaret. Yeah, so there's a big difference between cost and value for money in relation to these types of programs. I'll take 2 more questions.
Hi, Robin Barry from the Burren. There's a very serious situation within the Burren with the extensive, within particularly the porous karst landscape within the Burren, with the extensive use of Roundup by the National Parks and Wildlife Service within the parks, and also with some farmers as well, using the Roundup to control the scrub, the hazel scrub. I want to know, is there been any kind of quantitative analysis on the effect of flora and fauna in the Burren with the overuse of Roundup, and has there been any analysis done on surface and groundwaters for the trace elements of the Roundup?
In terms of analysis on the vegetation, there was some monitoring done to do with wiping of bushes, which showed, yes, you would get an impact around the area. And just let's say it's not only Roundup. Roundup is used as a catch-all, tends to be used as a catch-all term. Roundup is one of the herbicides used. We were able to show that if you use the herbicides in a targeted manner, you'd get a small impact. Within 3 years, it had recolonized back to what it was. So again, any herbicide is dangerous, as most chemicals are. It's the way that they're used. In terms of analysis that's being done, it's the county councils and that are doing water monitoring, and we did ask them if there was anything being picked up, and they said they haven't picked up anything.
Thanks, Sharon. We're just going to have to move on, sorry. Can we take one last question from Owen? Thanks.
Thank you to the speakers and to Caroline for a really interesting talk. I thought it might be interesting to extend out what we're talking about for a second, and say that if we consider the fact that globally conservation discussions often center around a debate between what could be called land sparing and land sharing, and what we've been talking about here today has been practically all about land sharing, for very good reasons. I mean, I think that obviously in somewhere like the Burren, that's what's going to be required to achieve the kind of objectives you're looking for in terms of maximizing biodiversity. But in plenty of other situations, land sparing is equally valid and probably necessary in terms of achieving what Sharon Parr talked about. If you're talking about earlier on that you're looking at biodiversity as a product of what you're doing with the land, in addition to the food that's being produced, then there is also a place for other land being set aside entirely for the first of those 2 elements.
I'm conscious of the time now, Owen. Do you have a succinct question that they can respond to?
Okay. Well, I did want to introduce that in there, but I also wanted to ask them whether in the future they could foresee a place where the kind of scorecarding that's being applied to land sharing could actually be applied to land sparing? Or do they have any comments on that at all?
Well, I suppose so, but it depends who's going to pay for that product. It depends. There's no point in scoring something and getting a score unless there's it's a product. There's an incentive at the end, and the thing is, it's not going to come through agri-environment. It'll have to come through somewhere else, because usually those habitats, for example, we've got fantastic hazel woodlands in the Burren. We don't want to get rid of those. We just want to try and maintain our grasslands. They are actually excluded from the agricultural payments altogether.
Yeah,
so
isn't there
again,
an issue there, though? Wouldn't you say there's an issue there?
It depends on how
yeah.
you address that.
Yeah.
Amanda, do you have one?
Well, I just want, obviously, I suppose in the context of the Aran Islands, I don't think that's really applicable. Like, if you're talking about leaving...
Absolutely, I was talking
Yeah,
more generally across the country rather than just the Burren or the Aran Islands,
I think we all understand that what you're driving at there, Owen, and it all goes back to what James said yesterday about having an integrated land use policy that addresses the needs for nature as well as what agriculture can deliver from an ecosystem services point of view. I know there's an awful lot of Slido questions there. I think we did address some of them. Apologies, I'm not going to address them all now. Thank you all for your time and listening. I want to thank the three speakers for a very, very interesting session, and it's lunchtime as well, so thanks very much.